Good evening. My name is Francesca Ammon, and I'm truly delighted to welcome everyone here to the public launch event for the Digital Urban Humanities project called Sunset Over Sunset. And this website uses street view photographs of Los Angeles's iconic Sunset Boulevard to uncover stories of everyday change in the post-war built environment. And we'll tell you a whole lot more about what we mean by that over this hour-long session. So on behalf of myself and my fellow co-directors of this project, who are Brian Goldstein and Garrett Nelson, I want to begin by thanking my home school, the Weitzman School of Design at the University of Pennsylvania, for hosting this webinar. Thanks also to Swarthmore College, the Leventhal Map and Education Center at Boston Public Library, the Getty Research Institute, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, who are all our important institutional partners in this project. And at Penn, I especially want to thank Lainey Myers, Micah Dornfeld, Michael Grant, and John Caperton for all their help with the logistics for tonight. So we're really delighted to have this chance to thank the many individuals and organizations who helped to make this website possible. I think it took about 6 years and so many people to make this happen. And the list of valued contributors is long and includes web designers, advisory board members, research assistants, university support staff, and colleagues at Getty and the NEH. And I know many of you are on this call right now. You'll find many of their names on the website's About page. Our main goal tonight, though, is really to share with you our new website, Sunset Over Sunset, which we hope you'll find to be both a fun and informative historical research tool. Brian, Garrett, and I, when we first dreamed this all up several years ago, were so excited as we envisioned what this website could be. And it's really a thrill to now see it come to fruition. So in order to provide a brief roadmap for our presentation, I just want to briefly introduce each of our 5 speakers for tonight. We'll begin with Brian Goldstein, who is Associate Professor of Art History at Swarthmore College and the author of The Roots of Urban Renaissance, Gentrification and the Struggle Over Harlem. Brian will introduce us to the work of artist Ed Ruscha, including especially the photographic archive that underpins Sunset Over Sunset. Next, Garrett Nelson, a historical geographer and president and head curator at the Leventhal Map and Education Center at Boston Public Library, will suggest some of the big urban, planning, and architectural questions that Ruscha's archive raises for historians. As I said, I'm Francesca Ammon, Associate Professor of City and Regional Planning and Historic Preservation here at Penn, and also the author of Bulldozer, Demolition and Clearance of the Post-War Landscape. And in my remarks, I'll take everyone on a brief tour of the website itself, introducing its functional capabilities and its depth of data. Next, Rob Nelson, who is director of the Digital Scholarship Lab at the University of Richmond, will discuss his work designing and developing the website. Rob is at the forefront of the digital and especially the digital urban humanities, having also worked to develop projects including mapping inequality and renewing inequality as part of American Panorama. Mark Padoongpatt, Associate Professor of Asian American Studies and Interdisciplinary Studies at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and the author of Flavors of Empire, Food and the Making of Thai America, will then briefly present a case study of how he used the website to further his own research on the history of Thai immigration and placemaking. And his fuller essay appears under the stories section of the website, and we'll point that all out to you. Finally, Brian will return to conclude our prepared remarks and open up the floor for Q&A. So with that in mind, please feel free to post questions to the chat throughout our presentations. We'll see those, and we'll be glad to respond to those toward the end of the event. All right, now I welcome Brian Goldstein to get us started.
Thanks, Francesca, and thank you to everyone in our audience this evening. I'm going to ask you to put on the first slide, Francesca. The center of Sunset Over Sunset are the photographs it depicts and their creator, Ed Ruscha. Ruscha is surely familiar to many of you. Recently, he was celebrated in a career retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art, an exhibition that will open at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art next month. Over the last 6 decades, Ruscha has made his name as one of the foremost artists in the US, a painter, printmaker, and photographer whose subject has often been the iconography of the American built environment, gas stations, billboards, parking lots, and factories, among others. One of the most distinctive of Ruscha's bodies of work comprises a series of artist books he made beginning in the 1960s, which investigated these subjects, and in doing so, forced his readers to consider anew the importance of the vernacular landscape and the view from the road. These books include such titles as 26 Gasoline Stations from 1963 and 1965's Some Los Angeles Apartments. Next slide, please. In 1966, Ruscha published Every Building on the Sunset Strip, perhaps the most famous of this series. In an accordion-fold book nearly 25 feet long, Ruscha documented both sides of the Sunset Strip, a mile and a half of LA's iconic Sunset Boulevard that runs through West Hollywood. While Sunset Strip is an intensely interesting commercial stretch of the city and a historically and culturally significant one, Ruscha, who was a transplant to Los Angeles from Oklahoma, understood that it gave only a partial view of this much longer street and the city it transited. Sunset Boulevard runs 22 miles from downtown Los Angeles to the Pacific Ocean, and Ruscha set to document the entirety of the boulevard in the years after his famous book. He made 10 more photographic journeys along Sunset between 1973 and 2007, running through blocks of dense stores, past film studios and hospitals, and across some of the city's tallest buildings. Next slide, please. Ruscha took these photographs using an automated process that is evident in the photos themselves. He rigged up a Nikon camera on the back of his pickup truck with a motorized shutter that clicked exposures at even intervals as the artist and his collaborators made their way across the street, along the street, I should say. They went to other iconic LA boulevards too, Melrose, Hollywood, and the Pacific Coast Highway, among others, but visited Sunset most often. But for a few exposures that he revisited in photographic and painting projects in the years that followed, he filed these cans of developed film away. And despite a public persona as a laid-back urban cowboy, Ruscha proved to be a methodical archivist. His systematic documentation of urban change in a global metropolis, adding up to hundreds of thousands of photos awaiting an unknown future use. In 2012, the Getty Research Institute acquired Ruscha's Streets of Los Angeles archive, as this body of work is known, and began the Herculean task of digitizing it so that these largely unseen photographs could become a research resource. Getty Research Institute staff focused on streets Ruscha had photographed more than once, including Sunset, and in the process they scanned or digitized, I should say, more than 120,000 photographs. In 2018, the GRI issued a public call for researchers interested in interpreting Ruscha's archive, describing these photos as, quote, almost certainly the most significant artistic attempt to record the urban fabric of a city in the post-war era, unquote. GRI recognized images of Sunset and other streets as material to be regarded by art historians interested in this largely unknown body of work by a major artist, but also saw its potential for a range of other fields of scholarly inquiry, including architecture, scholarship on film, digital humanities, and history, among others. Next slide, please. Francesca, Garrett, and I, as historians with a shared interest in urban change, saw in this resource a story of the city that had often eluded archival documentation. In photos of buildings renovated, businesses expanded, signs changed in font or in language, and trees grown or removed are the stories of individual entrepreneurs making their way in a new city, changing populations, and the material evidence of bigger transformations like global immigration, economic consolidation, and climate change. And I'll just draw your attention in these three photos to the palm trees, which grow ever larger in each photo. In other words, we saw in the juxtaposition and analysis of photographs like these an incredible ability to document how cities have changed over the last half century in extraordinary fine-grained detail and to facilitate that research by others. Next slide, please. Sunset Boulevard is particularly apt for this kind of study. As much as Ruscha's images offer a transect of LA's physical geography, they also offer a cross-section of its social geography. Sunset spans some of the city's wealthiest and least well-off neighborhoods, the sites of ventures that have endured nearly unchanged, and communities that have grown and constantly transformed in the time span of his photos. We propose to create a digital tool that can portray and explore photos of places like Echo Park, Hollywood, and Silver Lake, while joining them to other kinds of evidence that historians use to understand urban change, which you'll hear about shortly. With the partnership of the Getty, that effort culminated in Sunset Over Sunset. In 1972, Ruscha explained every building on the Sunset Strip to an interviewer. As he said, and I quote, "All I was after was that storefront plane. A storefront plane of a Western town is just paper, and everything behind it is just nothing." Yet, as urban historians, we know that behind the facade is never nothing, and Ruscha's frequent visits to photograph Sunset indicate that he knew this too. In fact, the story they tell is one of dynamic social, political, and cultural change in the American city. In Sunset Over Sunset, we seek to illuminate that change and to help you to explore that change too. And now I'll hand it over to Garrett.
Thanks, Brian. As I'm sure you can already imagine, looking at some of the photos that Brian has shown, the sheer scale of the Streets of Los Angeles archive, and in particular, their extraordinary seriality across space and time, opens up a provocative sense of possibilities that have much to do with the dynamic relationship between what has been preserved from the past and what it is possible for us to know and think about the past. Now, for most urban historians, the classic story of the 20th century US city has been one focused on the impact of large-scale projects and plans. Visually epitomized by aerial photographs or planners' maps awash with abstract colors, this familiar story tends to prioritize the actors, like the three that you see in this photograph, who had the power to make these kinds of massive changes: bureaucrats, politicians, developers, bankers, and so on. This story is well told not simply due to its drama and scale and kind of obvious nature, but because these powerful actors tended to accumulate and preserve comprehensive archives. Government reports, development proposals, financial worksheets, and engineering diagrams lend themselves well to this kind of historical investigation. We'll go to the next slide. To use just two Los Angeles examples, Dodger Stadium and the Bunker Hill redevelopment are the types of projects which left behind huge and obvious imprints on the built environment itself, together, crucially, with extensive paper trails, the stuff that historians make great effect of in investigating the past. Now, that classic story of top-down, large-scale urban change has been challenged to great effect by historians who have drawn attention to the importance of smaller-scale, fine-grained interventions in the urban landscape. Whether these changes were conducted by residents, tenants, building managers, craftspeople, shop owners, community clubs, small-scale developers, or other similar actors, these human-scale changes accounted for the better part of what most people actually experienced every day in the changing city. But for the most part, these histories and the scholarly approaches to vernacular landscapes more generally have relied on evidence that is at least site-specific, if not ephemeral or even anecdotal. It's possible to look at one or two or maybe even 20 small gestures in the urban landscape using close historical looking, but it's another challenge entirely to examine the aggregate effect of hundreds of thousands or millions of such small gestures in the urban landscape. What kind of archive could possibly even capture that vast tapestry of detail? Go to the next slide. Wittingly or unwittingly, and probably in fact in some puckish combination of both, Ed Ruscha and his collaborators managed to create just such an archive for a handful of streets in Los Angeles from the 1960s to the early 2000s. At more than just a metaphorical level, this enormous visual record brings us down to the street level to examine the evolving urban landscape of Los Angeles. If archives of maps and plans present an abstract, orthographic view of the city at large as an imaginary game board onto which powerful actors inscribed colossal plans, this archive, The Streets of Los Angeles, consists of hundreds of thousands of photographs that present an altogether different view of the city, seen from the perspective of pedestrians and drivers and bus riders and customers looking out of strip mall windows. There is quite simply no other archive quite like it. The closest parallel might be found in the handful of official photographic surveys conducted by tax assessors, but even those cannot replicate the panoramic verisimilitude of Ruscha's stitched-together photographs, as if we are really walking down the streets of 1960s and 1970s and 1980s Los Angeles. The only real comparison, of course, is to today's Google Street View, which inaugurated an entirely new concept of how we might visualize cities, but which has only a shallow historical archive that dates back to around 2007. Like Google Street View, but with a period that covers half a century, the Streets of Los Angeles archive at the Getty Research Institute challenges us to do close looking and distant looking at an urban landscape all at the same time, confounding methodological assumptions about scale while also opening up new questions for academic and public historians alike. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Francesca to take us through a hands-on tour through Sunset Over Sunset, the web project our team built to invite users into this perspective on the changing city.
Thanks, Garrett. All right, we're now sharing the website live. Okay. So there are four main interfaces for exploring the research questions that Garrett has just raised. The first three, the panorama, address, and pop-up views, facilitate the examination of historical evidence by website users and visitors themselves. And the final interface, stories, offers curated investigations of Sunset Boulevard as researched by a range of scholars. And over the next few minutes, I'm going to briefly demo each of these elements of the web page. And when the webinar is through, I invite you to try out this website navigation for yourself. We truly hope that you'll find it to be relatively intuitive and also integrative as an interface. So let's begin with the panorama view, which is where you arrive when you go to our website, www.sunsetoversunset.org. We've organized 6 years of street views arranged year over year, one for each decade of Ruscha's photographs of sunset. By clicking the Head East or Head West buttons, simply scrolling right or left with individual taps on the arrow keys, or even clicking on one of the spots along the diagrammatic street outline at the top to make a bigger geographic leap, users can move along the Sunset Boulevard landscape, comparing visual change as they go. And this, your routing along here is up to you. You navigate. Although Ruscha photographed more than 20 miles of sunset's length, as Brian described, we focus on a 10-mile, largely commercial stretch for closer analysis, and only these one per decade view. The scroll distance slider in the middle there allows users to control the speed of their travels along the boulevard, adjusting the distance traveled with each arrow click. Maybe you want to move slowly. Maybe you want to jump quickly. That's how you moderate that. The search and filter drop-down enables users to jump to a specific address or to turn certain years on or off from view. So you want to compare the earliest year with the latest year directly. And clicking the Look South or Look North button on the left allows users to shift their viewing orientation between opposite sides of the street. And you'll see that if you're looking at the map at the same time, you'll see that the orange view shed indicator on the map reflects which direction you're viewing as you switch from one side to the other. All right, let's move in a little closer into one of the images. Double click on Enter. That brings up a full screen version of that photograph in what we call the pop-up view. Using the left-right arrows on your keyboard, you can still continue to scroll along the boulevard, moving left or right, that is east or west, but within this larger pop-up view landscape. If you click on the photo using the you double click or use the plus or minus controls, you can zoom in and out and really gain a fabulous level of detail. If we X out of this and go back to the panorama, in order to better represent the urban world that the photographs depict, Sunset Over Sunset organizes Ruscha's work spatially rather than in the folder structure that's more typical of a traditional archive. We've also manually added address numbers to the panorama so that viewers can more precisely locate these streetscapes in space. Clicking on any one of these address numbers opens up yet another interface, the address view, where visitors can dig deeper into the historical context of any one location. And this is where we've really married a variety of sources in one place. Left and right arrows, again, allow for continued movement along the boulevard, but still within this address-focused perspective. As we move down this page, each address page includes historical socioeconomic data for that address's census tract, and depending upon the availability of information for any one address, it's likely to show the list of past occupants, which we've taken from city directories, relevant newspaper articles from publications including the Los Angeles Times, Los Angeles Sentinel, and the Spanish language La Opinión. One-off online social cultural resources where they exist, and also direct links into Los Angeles municipal databases for the property's tax assessments, building records, and zoning. So all those things are united in this one portal by address. Within the address view, by clicking on the Show Photographs button at the upper right, viewers can alternatively shift from these text-based records to a visual snapshot of historical photographs of that property from across the 5 decades. So we've lumped them all together on one page for easy comparison. Here again, were we to click on the panorama link at this time, we're not going to do that. But if you were to do that in the upper right, you would return right back to where you were on the map. So you can jump between one or the other as you go. Instead, let's dig deeper into the photographs for this sample address. As in the panorama view, double-clicking on any one photograph within the address brings up that pop-up interface, including the screen zoomable image. A button at the bottom left lists nearby addresses that likely appear in that photograph to the best of our estimation. Clicking on any one of those brings up the corresponding address page. But clicking on the citation link to the Getty Research Institute at the bottom right opens up a new tab showing the digitized image in the Getty's research browser, along with their digital filing structure and all their associated metadata. So you can jump between that, and that's where all the photographs reside, in fact. We are pulling them in selectively into the website, but they all reside at the Getty, and you can go there. We go back to Sunset over Sunset, though. I want to take us to our last interface, which is the stories section. And in this area, it's different. As I mentioned at the beginning, we've got 3 views for users and another really for interpretation of what other users have found as they've used this site. Here we knit together photographs and properties to illuminate histories that have unfolded along the boulevard, offering a platform to ask, what story of Sunset do we tell if we tell it through blank? And that blank could include, for example, gas stations, banks, restaurants, palm trees, signage, transportation, sex work, Latinx businesses, mini malls, LGBTQ spaces, all topics that are currently represented on or in progress for the site. And there are, of course, as you can imagine, many other stories embedded within this archive. Each of these lenses reveals specific stories of this street, as well as larger urban histories across decades of extensive physical, social, economic, and cultural transformation. Ruscha's photographs offer a unique and often previously invisible archive for uncovering these street-level histories, which then help to deepen and at times even reframe our understanding of mid to late 20th century urban life and development. And for example, in a forthcoming story that I've authored on gas stations, I examined how disappearing Texacos and Shell stations, for example, on Sunset, indexed larger dynamics like suburbanization and the 1970s gas crisis. These stories demonstrate the potential of these photographs as historical evidence themselves. To date, we've published 3 such stories for the website, with over a half a dozen more to be added in the coming year, on our way to forming a substantial edited collection of these stories. Later on in tonight's program, you'll hear from Mark Padoongpatt, an author of a story about Thai immigration, who will help bring the research potential of this archive to light. But first, I'd like to introduce Rob Nelson, our website designer and developer, who can take us a little bit deeper into the technical side of the project. Thanks, Rob.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is a real pleasure for me to be part of this project. I came into it when it was fully conceptualized and almost entirely designed. So I've been very much in the weeds of the minute details of technical development of this project for probably a couple of years. And I want to kind of step outside of the weeds because no one wants to hear about the weeds. And I just want to almost offer a comment more as a commentator and somebody who's been involved and interested and active in the digital humanities for more years than I care to admit at this point, and just offer one thought about what Sunset Over Sunset contributes and does really, in my mind, exceptionally as a digital humanities project. I always think about digital humanities when I'm developing projects as like how much of this is going to be interpretive and scholarly and argumentative, and how much of this is going to be open-ended and heuristic and and exploratory. And I think what Sunset Over Sunset does incredibly well is balance those two things, and does both of them really exceptionally. So, on the one hand, Francesca was just demonstrating the panorama pages, the address pages. These are really incredible tools. Both for a researcher comes in and has a question that this archive can help them answer, and wants to use this as a tool to begin to address those questions, or just a person that comes in there with curiosity and wants to play and explore and make sense of this archive, and see what interests them and follow those interests through this interface. So that's the open-ended, exploratory, writerly side of this project. But the stories are readerly. They offer interpretations and arguments, and they serve a different audience, an audience that really wants to hear from experts that have really deep expertise in a particular subject and have really thought through what this archive can tell us about any number of topics. That could be placemaking, that could be the changing architectural and natural environment of this place. The possibilities really there are limitless. So, this is kind of me stepping back from being any kind of participant in this and contributor to this project, because all the credit for this goes to Francesca, Brian, and Garrett for conceptualizing and designing what in my mind is an exceptional project. With that, I'll turn it over to Mark, who contributed a story about Thai placemaking for the project.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. So I had a lot of fun cruising Sunset on this site. I love trying to square, as Rob mentioned, what I know or what I think I know about Los Angeles with Ruscha's photos. I love the stories feature, which inspires you to really think about the kinds of stories we can tell. From the start, I think I was thinking about privatization and militarization of urban space. I was also thinking about public transit infrastructure. But ultimately, I thought that the biggest test or challenge would be to see if Ruscha's photos could tell me something new or provide more evidence on a topic and issue I already knew really well. And that was the impact of Thai immigration on East Hollywood and the making of Thai Town in early Thai America. And so what I knew was that Thai Town was formally established in 1999 by the city of Los Angeles as a historic ethnic neighborhood and a Preserve America community, mainly due to the efforts of the Thai Community Development Center. And I knew that the heart of Thai Town was a half-mile stretch on Hollywood Boulevard, which is a block north of Sunset Boulevard. It's the first of its kind in the nation. It became wildly popular for Thai food and restaurants. It was even featured in Anthony Bourdain's No Reservations in 2007, and that it has also been redeveloped to be more explicitly, quote unquote, Thai, a Thai space in terms of the built landscape and architectural design elements, signage, etc. But Ruscha's photos made me think differently about Thai Town beyond this kind of landmark-oriented cultural preservation version of urban redevelopment and transformation. And I learned two key things, which I flesh out in my full story. One, I learned more about the way ordinary immigrants, and ordinary people, rather than civic leaders, political organizations like the Thai CDC, or corporate developers have made an extraordinary impact on metropolitan landscapes, even as they may not have worked formally or intentionally to do so. So Thai immigrants made place through these smaller actions that we've been talking about, smaller actions, decisions, and expressions at the everyday street level, and what my colleagues have called redevelopment vernacular. Right? It's a nuanced, subtle, and gradual story of change and space claiming and transformation, characterized by the rehabilitation, modification, and reuse of property. And these efforts created places to ease the adjustment and transition for newly arrived Thais and allow Thai American identity to flourish. Francesca, can you show the first slide or that slide? Yes. So take, for example, Siam Sunset Restaurant. The restaurant, 5265 Sunset in East Hollywood, has some of the best Thai food in Los Angeles. It's one of my top recommendations for people. The late Pulitzer Prize winning restaurant critic Jonathan Gold raved about the food and called it the Thaiest Thai in Thai Town. And what's interesting is that Siam Sunset, as you can see, is part of a motel. And Gold mentions this in his review, writing that, quote, the restaurant commands perhaps the least promising location in Hollywood, a tiny L-shaped diner attached to an America's Best Value Inn. Next slide, please. And Ruscha's panoramas tell the story of how this came to be, as you can see here, right? When he first took his image in 1973, this L-shaped diner was a Mr. Ed's coffee shop attached to the Bahia Motel, a sort of two-story roadside motel with a U-shaped layout. 1985, it becomes Bobo China, which is a Mandarin-style Chinese restaurant. And then in 1995, we see Siam Sunset has already arrived. A new bilingual Siam Sunset sign with Thai Chinese food at the bottom adorns the storefront. The pagoda-shaped doors that were put in place by Bobo China have now been replaced by French doors with a banner-like sign above in Thai. And the property's exterior is bare-boned, and the entire motel appears to have fallen into disrepair, perhaps even out of business, and the walls graffiti. But by 2007, the motel had been renovated into the corporate-owned America's Best Value Inn, with Siam Sunset now sporting a subtle facelift and painted over. The graffiti's been painted over. There's now brown roof trim to match the renovation. And what we see with Siam Sunset as the Thaiest Thai in Thai Town is, I believe, typical of post-1965 immigrant placemaking and urban transformation in the US. The second thing that I learned, and next slide, please, Francesca. Ruscha's photos also raised important questions about how Thai American community and identity was shaped relationally. That is, in relation to other diasporic and immigrant populations, as opposed to just dominant white host society. So when Thais began moving there in the late 1970s, East Hollywood was home to poor and working class Asian, Latino, and Armenian migrants. And Thai Town also overlaps with Little Armenia. The view of Thai Town from Hollywood Boulevard makes this difficult to see, but Ruscha's panoramas lay it bare. So in 1995, in this photo here, we can see Chiang Mai Cafe. It's behind the sunset sign, but Chiang Mai Cafe Thai restaurant shared a plaza with Hong Kong Bakery and Sahag's Basturma, which is a popular Armenian sandwich shop. And so ultimately, and perhaps kind of ironically, Ruscha's flat sunset facades allowed me to get behind the carefully crafted image of formally designated ethnic neighborhoods like Thai Town. And his photos reveal a more complicated relationship between ethnic heritage preservation and urban revitalization, allowing us to consider what a more expansive and accurate narrative of immigrant placemaking might look like in Los Angeles and beyond. So thank you. I am sending that over to or back to Francesca.
I will jump in and I will take this
Right.
chance to plug Mark's wonderful Flavors of Empire, a book that we learned a lot from in the process of this project. Thank you, Mark. So of course today in these 40 minutes we can only give you a glimpse of Sunset Over Sunset, and we invite you to take the time to look through the site in the coming days to explore what we intend as a mix of the scholarly and fun, the exploratory and the expository, the fine-grained and the panoramic. As a reminder, the site's address is www.sunsetoversunset.org. I have also put that in the chat. I'll just invite you to submit questions as I'm closing things out here, and we'll come back to those in a moment. We'd encourage you to please share the site with others who might be interested. And we hope that you'll find ways to bring the site into your research and teaching too. And we really hope that you let us know how you do that, and certainly let us know if we can visit your courses or otherwise help you use Sunset Over Sunset. We found that it's a wonderful teaching resource, and also there was no end to the questions that one can answer through the site. And we would love for others to take the baton now that this exists in the world. So for the next 15 or so minutes, we'd be glad to answer any questions that folks in the audience have. I believe the best way to do that is to submit them via the Q&A link at the bottom of your Zoom page. And we'll just give you a few moments to submit any, and then we'll pick them up from you. So thank you again. And we look forward to hearing more from you about your work on the site. So we have a first question. I'll ask the question, and maybe I'll invite Mark and Francesca and Garrett and Rob to answer rather than me answering. So the question is, as you worked with all these photos, what were some of the more memorable or surprising things you noticed in some of the photos? Who'd love to take that one first?
I want to answer with something that maybe not the direct thing that you think of. I'm thinking back to when we first started this project, and the three of us went and walked some of Sunset Boulevard and ate at one of the restaurants and tried to experience it. And as expansive as these photographs are, and as seemingly all encompassing, how different it felt to walk on there too. So this is just a surprise that. Even though we have this wonderful and rich, data-rich archive here, there's obviously something still different. As we get closer and closer to the expansiveness of this, there's still something, it's an obvious point, but it's something that was really striking. The topography, the width of the street, that's still three-dimensional sense of the place. How long it took to walk from place to place also. So I think it's just a helpful reminder that as we move into, and as we move into these other sources, the place itself is still utterly incapturable, right? And we have to maintain that awareness. So that's a kind of side answer, I think, to that question.
I know one type of detail that we would always be sort of screenshotting and chatting about was the density of commercial advertising, not just big billboards, but even like shop window signs or the typefaces on like a shop, the name of a shop. And it occurred to me a lot when you're working more traditional archives, like for instance newspapers. There is a lot of course commercial advertising in that format, but not built environment commercial advertising. So being able to see that in a way that really is not captured in any other archive, and at such scale. Of course, Los Angeles is a particular city where this type of advertisement is prevalent. Even in the titled slide that's up on Fran's screen right now, there's a bill. You see a little billboard changing just in that little snapshot, and those types of examples of visual evidence are everywhere in these photos.
Yeah, I mean, I think we found just endless bits of trivia as we were looking, early posters for bands that have become world famous, and people in cool clothes waiting for stores to open. And a favorite thing that I know the Getty folks really got to like too is because Sunset is largely a horizontal glass plane. When you're in the commercial areas, there's these little self-portraits of Ruscha and his collaborators that, pop up as they're being reflected in shop windows. But one thing, and Francesca and Garrett will make fun of me for mentioning this, but it's an important one, is there's a Bank of America in West Hollywood that essentially just doesn't change throughout any of the photographs except as the Bank of America branding changes. And it's just a kind of a fascinating example of one of the bigger stories that the street tells, which is how a commercial street that had, I think, around 25 banks when Ruscha first started taking photos, only had a few different companies represented by the end of the photos. And that's because companies like Wells Fargo, which is a West Coast bank, and Bank of America, which is a West Coast bank, sort of won the globalization struggle. As companies became multinational, they were some of the consolidators. So they sort of bought up all these other banks. And the endurance of this little modern building, essentially unchanged, testified to the kind of might of its corporate owner. So lots of interesting things like that. We found often subtlety, stasis, unchangingness actually was as revealing as change. That's certainly true with restaurants too. There's some restaurants that have been there for 40, 50 years, and that obviously tells a much bigger story that we've been diving into in the stories. Garrett, do you want to take the next question?
Sure. So there's a question from Elizabeth Cohen about two questions. How has Ruscha responded to your work? And is there a search function? So if I wanted to investigate fast food sites, for an example, could I find them? I'll take the second part of that first, which is that this is actually something that we want to do and was sort of scoped out in our original design, but it hasn't been implemented yet for a number of reasons. One is just the sort of hand labor that's required in sort of tagging or identifying those sites. Perhaps someday we'll have an army of undergraduates to do this for us. But the Getty Research Institute did experiment a little bit with trying to use machine vision to kind of computer tag and code sites. And I'm sure the GRI folks could say more about that and the results of that process. We didn't find that a lot of the kind of computer tagged metadata was really useful at scale. You could sort of find like cars or things that were relatively straightforward for a computer to identify, but nothing on the order of fast food sites. Brian or Francesca, do you want to say more about the Ruscha response?
I just wanted to add to what you were saying right there that actually 12 Sunsets, the other website, can be used in as a companion piece of this too, because they read some of the text on signs. So and with all the we know how well OCR works. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, right? But when you toggle between the two, you can kind of you can use that as a tool. And then once you kind of know where you want to be, then you can really explore those sites on ours. So I think using them as companion pieces is a wise thing to do. They're complementary and have kind of different purposes, but largely, nicely complementary.
In terms of the Ruscha question, I saw a couple of folks ask that. It's a very good question. I think the simple way to answer this is that it's a project that was obviously a tremendous commitment for him and something that he was very attached to, but also that he never really kind of broadcast as an artistic project that he was working on. It was something that he did consistently and has done books like Then and Now about Hollywood Boulevard since the Every Building on the Sunset Strip sort of starting point, and certainly the interest in change over time is something he's investigated a lot in his work. But this archive just sort of had a strange status, and I think somewhat a status perhaps of a bit of indifference for him. What is this thing? Is it a work of art? Is it? I'll argue, yes, of course, it's a work of art. But for a very commercially successful artist, it had a more uncertain status. So he certainly knows about the work Getty's been doing with collaborators, of which we're one project. There's a handful of other folks working on different aspects of this archive. He's been supportive in that way. He's been supportive in allowing folks to use these images, to let us borrow his copyright, essentially. And it's been included, our work and that of some others, in the retrospectives. There was a film made for the retrospectives that is available through the Museum of Modern Art's website and through, hopefully will be in the LACMA exhibit in some form next month. So all those are ways that he's sort of recognized us without having a direct conversation about this particular project. But we certainly hope he'll find it and maybe dig into it too, because it shows a vast archive that, except for the work we've been doing and the Getty folks, is otherwise just not seeable. It's just too much to be seen, if not for these kinds of projects. And that's why the digital aspect of it is so exciting.
I'll take there's a next question on there from Amelia Martinez, Weitzman alum, art and city planning alum. Thanks for joining us, Emilio. Emilio asks if there are other academic projects taking artworks as starting points or archives to mind that have led to expansive interdisciplinary spatial research projects like your own, and what other projects Sunset Over Sunset might be in conversation with in this particular field. So we should make clear that, when Getty issued the initial call for a variety of individuals to work with this amazing archive, other people came at it in equally interesting and different ways. And so there's a whole edited collection that will be coming out in 2025, which just lots of different ways of coming at this particular archive, whether you're privileging film, art, architecture, planning, the artist himself, and other angles that I'm not even mentioning right now. And so that will be the other interesting thing about it is it's going to be an online publication that really utilizes the potential of this digital archive too, and there'll be ways to interact with that too. So keep a lookout for that, and that's other projects in this particular realm. But in terms of the digital urban humanities, there are a lot of wonderful projects that we see ours in conversation with. Projects, Bunker Hill Refrain is one that's looking at urban renewal in Los Angeles. For example, there's 98 Acres in Albany. That's called Picturing Urban Renewal as the second iteration, looking at stories of urban renewal. And so there are lots of people thinking about how do we consolidate the information of urban change and make these digital archives available to people, and oftentimes privileging the perspectives of people who are displaced and smaller scale residents. And one thing we've tried to do here, I think, is to think about the potential explicitly of the photograph, and also moving away from that kind of top-down map view that often is useful. I found it useful in my own work too, for orienting here, and think about, what happens when we go down to the street and we look at that scale of things. And so we see a lot of exciting potential, and are happy to be among a lively group of people working in this area, and many others that I didn't mention, but just to name a few.
We can take a question from the Q&A panel, which I think you all don't see, but we do. Robin asked, was it that you knew about the Ruscha archive and wanted to think about how to best showcase it for urban historians, or were you looking to do an LA digital urban project and you came across the Ruscha archive? How did the project start? I think the simple answer to that is that we did not know about the archive. We did not plan to do an LA project, but learned about the archive, and all three of us had kind of shared interests that we thought would be exciting to bring together to this kind of crazy madcap collection of photos that had just endless possibilities. And we all liked the work of Ruscha a lot, and had certainly known of him as an artist, but to sort of think of him in a fairly instrumental way, actually, as a person who was creating an archive to mine to tell urban history, not really to think about it as an art historian might at all, was kind of the premise that we started with, knowing that other people would take this on and with more art historical questions. I think there's really good questions to be asked about this as a work of art, but that's not our intention. And so, just the simple fact that this existed was really what kind of started us down the path. All three of us are interested in small scale urban change, rehabilitation, scale in general. So it spoke to our interest and was very generative as a result. We have another question from the webinar chat, which I will voice, and then somebody else can answer. Matt Lasner asked if we took note of consolidation of lots, small structures on small lots that at least give the appearance of individual ownership being replaced by larger buildings. So I'll ask that, and maybe as a part B, that maybe Mark, if you are interested, I guess a different version of that is what other kinds of captivating urban change did you see? You know, where did you see kind of development happening that you found particularly surprising, either through your own research on Thai LA or your own, sort of personal memory as an Angelino? So why don't we start with the first part, Francesca or Garrett?
Well, we certainly noticed that there are some obvious dramatic kind of built landscape changes where small lots are consolidated. But one other way that we actually noticed this was a sort of data challenge in that we first transcribed addresses and connected it to parcel data based on today's information from the city and county of Los Angeles. And of course, that information doesn't contain addresses for parcels that have been consolidated. So in some cases, you have even a whole block that today is a single address or a single parcel. But if you're looking at the Ruscha photographs in the 60s or the 70s, multiple or many addresses in that range. So we did have to do some hand tweaking, the imperfect hand tweaking in that way. And there's, potentially an interesting research project for somebody to actually go through and find all the places where you've got a super block or like a single big box store today that in the earlier years is in fact many, many parcels.
And some go ahead,
Go
Brian.
ahead. I was just going to say Home Depot and hospitals were two things that absolutely followed that pattern. Go ahead, Francesca.
Yeah, I was going to mention the hospital and just the expansive growth of that. And a phenomenon of when I was looking at the gas stations, for example, which are often on these corner locations, over time, a lot of those sites gave way and became mini malls. And so that's a different kind of small to large development. But as Brian highlighted in the case of the bank, it's really striking how many things didn't change, at least at that scale. And it was just a question of change of ownership, change of ethnicity of ownership too, and what's going on versus those big consolidation of lots. So you find it all in here. And certainly you could quantify what was happening more and things like that if you wanted to. That's definitely possible. But we could find wonderful examples on either end.
Yeah, and I think just to chime in to kind of respond to Brian's question, that I did actually take note of maybe not individual lots, but the development of these huge kind of retail shopping centers. There's one of the places that I mentioned that had kind of strong ethnic expression in terms of on their signage was a Thai video store that would just said Thai video in Thai, and it was on the second floor of a newly developed, clearly kind of corporate Sunset Center Plaza, and that had replaced in, I think by 1985 it was there, and that's where the video store, the image of the video store is. But before that, it was a single family home, and there was two single family homes, pretty sizable lot. And then by 1985, it's gone, and you have this two-story center plaza that had replaced it. So I did make note of that just as one example.
And a related version of that is Barragán's, which is a Mexican restaurant in the eastern part of Sunset, just kind of grew over the course of the photos, as it went from a very small single storefront to a kind of restaurant empire with multiple locations in the city. And those are really important stories because it is easy to focus on the Home Depots and think about, the growth of these huge companies, which is a real and important story on the street, but also the ways that immigrant entrepreneurs became very successful and registered it through the changes in the built environment and their own kind of consolidation of space. That was something we found in quite a lot of places.
And also, your eyes immediately drawn not just to the buildings, but what happens when there is new construction and change, and what happens to the natural landscape, and particularly looking at new palm trees being planted in certain geographies where palm trees predominate. It often accompanies the new construction too. So lots of things are set in motion when buildings change on the boulevard.
Should we try to take Dolores Hayden's question from the Q&A, which is, would it be possible to get names or commercial and residential developers connected to the images? And maybe one thing just to highlight that really we felt was important about this project was to bring in the more traditional urban history sources and put them in conversation with the images. We've talked a lot about the images. The images are truly incredible, but they become even more powerful when they're coupled with these other sources that have names in them. And those are the sources of information that you'll find on the address page. There are really three that have names in them. One is transcribed from city directories. So these are traditional city directories that went by address, typically listing residents or occupants. We then also link to today's tax parcel data. So that gives information about who owns each parcel in, as of this moment. And then perhaps one of the most interesting, unfortunately, also slightly the most clumsy to access is the Department of Building and Safety's building records. You can jump from an address page to the sometimes pages and pages of building permits, demolition permits, all sorts of other official documents like that that are issued by the city or the county of Los Angeles. And those really offer this amazing trove of additional research. So we really want users to kind of notice something in the visual form of the images and then find these pathways into more traditional archives.
We have another question, Carolyn Crockett, two questions. One is about if we've noticed anything about in terms of investment pattern changes on the part of the city versus the state and how that reflected demographic changes across the decades. I'll start with that one first. We haven't tracked that thoroughly, but the resources are here to do that, and then that's part of why we consolidated them this way. I mean, obviously, you can look and you can notice certain patterns in terms of what kinds of buildings are going on, but you'd have to dig a little bit deeper to get into that, and that's why we wanted to unite all these sources together. So we haven't answered it, but there are stories to be written, Carolyn, and we welcome people to dig into these. If anyone else wants to respond to that one.
And we did add census data, which is obviously an imperfect source for kind of socio-demographic changes right at the immediate level of the street, since it's aggregating like a larger area, even kind of behind Sunset Boulevard. But we chose that specifically so that, you notice patterns in the images. You might see visual clues, for instance, of investment or disinvestment. Do they match up, right, to a changing demographic composition in the neighborhood, right? Do we see basically, structural racism play out when a block changes demographics? Does the city stop paving potholes or, keeping the bus stops up to date? Those are exactly the types of questions that we hope people will look at.
And go ahead, Francesca. I'll
Go ahead, guys.
well, I'm going to close it out. So I'll just note that Ed Ruscha, who is getting older, but still certainly with us, he had said that he wanted to do another photographic series of Sunset, another drive, and I think the pandemic delayed that, but maybe he'll be able to do that. And I think to your question, Carolyn, if he does, I think you'll see a very different sunset in some of these places that we have said were, remarkably static or slow moving in their development. The rapid development of West Hollywood and the Sunset Strip in the last 5 to 10 years is showing up in exactly the kinds of block clearing projects that were largely exceptional in the time of these photos. So I think that would become a very different version of the story, and certainly one that would be revealing. I wanted to just thank everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you for your interest in the project. Thank you for your questions and your enthusiastic comments. Thank you, Francesca, Garrett, Mark, and Rob, and the staff at Weitzman School for helping with this event. And certainly, please reach out to us if you have other thoughts and questions, and do spend time on the site. And have a good evening and a good rest of the week.
Good night.
All right. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.